My name is Reese Kimball, and I am 28 years old. And I want to tell you about the afternoon my grandfather's attorney turned to page 31 of his trust document and read a provision that nobody in the conference room had seen before, and that produced a silence I have thought about every day since. My grandfather, Walter, died 2 months ago. He was 81 years old and had lived in Raleigh, North Carolina for the last 30 years of his life, in the house where I had spent significant portions of my childhood, in the summers and holidays that my parents had organized around proximity to Walter and my grandmother Margaret, who had died 9 years before him. I need to describe my position in this family before I describe what happened in the conference room, because the position is why what happened in the conference room meant what it meant. I was the difficult grandchild. I have been called this by enough members of my family across enough years that I no longer resist the label, even though I have never fully agreed with the interpretation. What I was, from the time I was a child, was different from what the family expected. Not rebellious in any dramatic sense, simply wired differently, interested in different things, drawn to different paths than the ones the family had established as the appropriate ones for people with the last name Kimball. My uncle David, Walter's son, had built a successful financial advisory business. My Aunt Carol, Walter's daughter, had married into a family with professional standing and had produced children who were understood within the family to be on appropriate trajectories. My cousins Marcus and Julia, David's children, were respectively an attorney and a marketing executive. I was a ceramics artist living in Asheville who had left a conventional career path at 22 to do the thing I was actually built to do and had not looked back. My family had not been hostile about this choice in any direct way. They had simply organized their assessment of me around the choice, in the specific way that families organize their assessments of me: a slight adjustment in expectation, a particular register of polite distance, the specific tone of someone who has decided you are not quite what the family is, and has made peace with this by adjusting the investment. Walter had not adjusted the investment. Walter had always been the one exception. The conference room at the estate attorney's office in Raleigh was exactly what you would expect: a table, chairs, 5 of us on one side or around it: David and Carol and Marcus and Julia and me. The attorney, a woman named Sandra Price, who had practiced estate law for 22 years and who had handled Walter's affairs for the last 16 of them, sat across from us with the trust document in front of her. She read the standard provisions first: the house distribution, the financial accounts, the personal property, standard family distribution with some specific bequests for organizations Walter had supported. I listened. None of it was particularly unexpected. None of it had my name in it, which was also what I had expected. Then she reached page 31. Sandra stopped at page 31. She read the provision once to herself before she read it aloud, which I noticed because the pause was slightly longer than the pauses she had taken at other pages. Then she read it aloud. The provision described a separate trust account that had been established 16 years earlier and maintained separately from the main estate. The account had been funded at establishment and had been accumulating through investment since. The value at the time of Walter's death was listed as a specific number that I will not share here because it belongs to my financial life rather than to this story, but that produced a specific quality of attention in the room when Sandra read it. The distribution of this separate account was conditional on a single requirement. The provision stated that the funds would distribute to the named beneficiary upon the provision of a correct password, to be spoken in person to the trustee and verified against a sealed verification document held by Sandra's office since the trust's establishment. Sandra placed the sealed envelope on the table between us. She said she had held it for 16 years without opening it. She said she did not know its contents. She said she had been instructed to open it only when a beneficiary attempted to provide the password, to confirm whether the password offered was correct. David said, "I don't understand what this is." Sandra said, "Your father established a trust account 16 years ago with a specific password requirement for distribution." She said, "The named beneficiary is listed in the document." She said the condition for distribution is knowing the password. She told us the name of the beneficiary. It was mine. The room was quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when information has arrived that requires significant recalibration. David looked at the document, Carol looked at me, Marcus looked at Julia, Julia was looking at the table. Sandra said, "Do you know the password?" She was looking at me. I sat with the question for a moment, not because I was uncertain, because I was remembering the summer I was 12 and sitting with Walter in his workshop behind the house on a Saturday afternoon while he was building a cabinet and I was doing what I did in that workshop, watching and asking questions about everything he did, because the making of things had always interested me more than most of the things my family thought I should be interested in. He had said something that afternoon that I had held for 16 years without understanding fully why I had held it. He had said, "Reese, I am going to tell you something you should keep." He had said it the way he meant things, without preamble, looking at the piece of wood he was working rather than at me, which was how Walter communicated things he did not want to perform. He had told me a word. He had said, "That is your word." He had said, "Someday it will matter that you know it." I said, "Yes."
The
I
room
said, "I know the
recalibrated a
password."
second time when I said those words. The recalibration was visible on David's face, most specifically. A particular sequence of expressions that went through surprise, and then something harder to name, and then a composure he reassembled with the specific efficiency of a man who has been managing his responses for 62 years. Sandra said, "Would you like to provide it?" I said yes. I said the word my grandfather had told me on the Saturday afternoon in his workshop when I was 12. Sandra opened the sealed envelope. She read what was inside. She looked at me. She said, "That's correct." She processed the distribution paperwork over the following 2 weeks. The funds transferred to an account I had opened specifically for the purpose during those 2 weeks while the paperwork was processed. What happened in the room between the moment Sandra said, "That's correct," and the moment the meeting ended was a period I have replayed many times since. David asked Sandra whether the password provision could be contested. Sandra said the provision was a valid trust condition established 16 years ago by a mentally competent grantor with the verification envelope held in her firm's possession throughout, and that there was no legal basis for contesting a conditional distribution on the grounds that the condition had been met. Carol said, "Did you know about this?" She was asking me. I said, "I knew the password." I said, "I did not know what it was for." She said, "He never told you?" I said, "He told me the word and told me someday it would matter." She said, 16 years ago? I said, "Yes." I said, "I was 12. She was quiet. Marcus asked how Walter had decided on me specifically. I said, "I don't know exactly." I said, "You would have to ask him, and he is not available to ask." Marcus looked at the table. I understood that what was happening in the room for my family was not primarily about the money, though the money was significant, and I am not going to pretend it was not significant. What was happening was a reorganization of the family's understanding of Walter, who he had been paying attention to and why, and what he had known about each of his grandchildren, that he had communicated only in the specific private way of a man who had decided that public statements were less honest than private ones. He had told me a word on a Saturday afternoon and told me someday it would matter. He had then set up a trust account that would only distribute to me and only when I said that word. He had done this 16 years before his death, when I was 12 years old, before I had left the conventional path, before I had moved to Asheville, before I had built anything with my hands that anyone had seen. He had known at 12 who I was going to be. He had planned for it. I drove to Asheville that evening after the reading. The drive from Raleigh is about 3 hours through the mountains, and I drove it in the specific, focused quiet of someone who has a lot to think about and is not ready to think about any of it out loud yet. I thought about the workshop, the Saturday afternoons I had spent in that workshop across the summers of my childhood, while my cousins were elsewhere doing the things cousins do at summer gatherings. I had been drawn to the workshop not because Walter had insisted, but because the workshop was where Walter was being himself, in a way he was not always being himself in other contexts, and I had understood that even at 10 and 11 and 12. He built furniture, not professionally, as a practice, the specific meditative work of someone who found the making of things restorative in a way that the rest of his life's demands were not. He built carefully and slowly, and he explained what he was doing when I asked, and he asked me questions about what I was thinking about in the specific, genuine way of someone who wants to know rather than someone who is performing interest. He had said once, "I think you are going to build things too." I had said, "What kind of things?" He had said, "I don't know exactly." He had said, "The kind that take longer than they should and turn out right." That was what I made in Asheville, ceramics that took longer than they should and turned out right, pieces that people bought and kept, a practice that had sustained me for 6 years at the level of a real career, not a comfortable one, not an easy one, but a real one that was genuinely mine. Walter had understood at 12 what I was going to do with my life, before I understood it myself. He had responded by putting a word in my memory and a trust account in his estate plan, and holding both for 16 years until the circumstances required them. I called my mother from the car. She is not part of this story in the direct sense, but she is the parent who had always believed I was doing the right thing in Asheville, and who had never used the word difficult when she described me, and who deserved to hear what had happened from me directly, rather than from someone else. She was quiet for most of what I told her. Then she said, "He always knew you." I said, "Yes." She said, "I'm so glad he told you about it." I said, "He told me 16 years ago. He said someday it would matter." She said, "He was right." I said, "Yes."
I went back to Raleigh once more before the estate was fully closed, to Walter's house before it was transferred to my Uncle David per the will's distribution. I asked David's permission to spend an afternoon there, not to take anything, just to spend time in the space. He said yes, with the specific, careful courtesy of a man who has processed something difficult and arrived at a place of grudging respect for the outcome, even if not full peace with it. He said, "Take as long as you need." I went to the workshop. It was exactly as Walter had left it, which meant it was organized in the specific, careful way of a person who maintains their tools as a form of respect for the work. His workbench, his hand tools arranged on the wall, the cabinet he had been working on before he became too ill to work on things, still in its unfinished state, clamped and waiting for the next step that was never going to come from his hands. I sat at the bench for a long time. I thought about the 12-year-old version of me who had sat in this same space on Saturday afternoons, asking questions about wood and joinery and the specific way things fit together when they are made correctly. I thought about what Walter had seen in that version of me that had prompted him to tell her a word and say someday it will matter. I think he saw someone who was going to need something solid when the rest of the world was telling her that what she was building was not the right thing to build. I think he understood, in the way that people who have built things with their hands understand it, that a person who makes things needs to know that someone is paying attention to the quality of what they make, rather than to whether the making fits the expected category. He paid attention for 60 years. He planned 16 years in advance. He left a word with a 12-year-old and a sealed envelope with his attorney, and trusted that both would be where they needed to be when the time came. I am using the funds to buy a larger studio space in Asheville and to take on an apprentice, which is something I have wanted to do for 2 years and that the financial reality of a ceramics practice had made not yet possible. The apprentice starts in the spring. She is 21 years old and has the specific quality of someone who makes things because the making is what they are for, rather than because it is what anyone expected. I think Walter would recognize the quality. He was very good at recognizing it.
I took one thing from the workshop when I left, not a tool and not a piece of equipment, the small scrap of paper he had written the word on the day he told me, which I had kept for 16 years in the back of a journal without fully knowing why I kept it. I put it back on his workbench when I left. It had done what it was supposed to. It belonged to the workshop now. Drop your city in the comments. Hit subscribe. I will see you in the next one.